Welcome to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. On this show, we feature different programs, individuals, and initiatives focused on being more inclusive of individual needs. We invite you to learn right alongside us. If you want some additional resources or access to our courses, please visit our website or follow us on social media. But for right now, let's get right to the episode. Welcome back to the Assembling Inclusion podcast. Today, we are going to be featuring Sociability, an app that helps disabled people find accessible places to go and visit. And we are joined by Matt Pierri, the founder and CEO. So Matt, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Pleasure, Katie. Yeah, thanks for having me and looking forward to chatting further.
So let's just dive right into it. Sociability is tackling a very critical and important issue: the lack of readily available accessibility information when it comes to, businesses and public spaces. How did this problem inspire the creation of the app?
So Sociability very much driven by my own lived experience. So I myself am a wheelchair user, been using a wheelchair for 15 or so years now. And about 10 years ago, I moved to the UK to study from Australia. And so for me, I think I had taken for granted probably that at home, I had my setup and my routine and my networks and my support all pretty sorted. So whenever I was going out, I really felt confident about where I was going. And actually, it was that transition of moving from Australia to the UK, and in particular, thinking about university and where I would live and, where I would study and could I make friends, etc. That really kind of, I think, was my first understanding of if you don't know where you're going and if you don't know what you're going to face, and if you are concerned about accessibility, that anxiety and that stress and that uncertainty creates a really tangible barrier for people to be able to participate. And, this, unfortunately, for lots of disabled people, means that their worlds shrink and that they're unable to pursue the opportunity they want to and be spontaneous and feel confident in exploring. And so that was kind of my experience moving to the UK. It was a really challenging process. And I just thought this seems like a ridiculous thing to have to deal with in 2016. Sociability basically grew out of a student project that was set up to try and solve this problem in Oxford as a starting place.
It is kind of a ridiculous problem that it still exists, right? Especially with the age of technology and access to information so readily. It's really sad that there wasn't a solution prior to this.
So particularly for me, it was you had to live in college accommodation at the university. So you needed to live in one of these, there were 38 different colleges. You need to pick one. And, essentially that was where you were based for the 2 or 3 years you were there. And for me, it was this query of which ones are accessible to me? And this short answer I got was, we're not sure, you should ask them. And so, I think that was the kind of first insight into accessibility is not this kind of tick the box thing. You can't say, yeah, sure, it's accessible, don't worry about it. It's like I needed to know information about wheelchair access to the bedroom and the bathroom and the dining room and the library and the common room and the entrance, and I needed really high level of detail and a very high level of confidence that the information that I was getting was accurate. And that I think had, just not occurred. Well, I'm sure it occurred at times, but it hadn't been something that the university and the colleges had invested in. I think there was also sort of a stereotype that disabled people wouldn't travel. If they did come and study, they didn't want to do social things. They just stayed in their bedrooms and their bathrooms. And there was this, essentially just a lack of understanding around the space. So to your point, I think 100%, the fact that this problem exists still today, we're obviously trying to do our best to solve it, is a great shame. But for lots of reasons, I think it's come down to it's just been overlooked and it's been sort of swept under the rug. And so what we're really trying to do at Sociability is not just try and solve the problem, but also raise awareness about how important this is, not just for disabled people, to be honest, but for lots of people who have accessibility needs of all kinds.
And you brought up a good point about the checking the box of accessibility, because one of the things I really liked when looking at your app was that it was avoiding a blanket statement of this is accessible, this is inaccessible. And you were doing a lot more in terms of detail and really showing the different types of accessibility as opposed to just having that general overarching, look at this, it's accessible. So what type of filters or accessibility information is available for users to customize within their searching and Sociability?
So I think the first thing to note is that we really think accessibility needs to be about, more than compliance. It needs to be about functionality. It has to help somebody do something in a space. And then actually more than just being functional, it really should be inclusive. You should feel like the space has been designed to welcome you, not the kind of tokenistic additional bit that's stuck on the end and you can get in, but you're sort of, very much second class. And so when we think about accessibility from that functionality and inclusion perspective, for us, a few things come to mind. The first is that the information really needs to be across the disability spectrum. So we have information for people with mobility impairments, visual, hearing, sensory. I think that's definitely something we, really pride ourselves upon. I mean, I'm a wheelchair user, a lot of the team are wheelchair users, but we very actively want to think about invisible disabilities. And in particular, how do we help the sensory environment be made much more apparent to people before they come? Then in terms of the type of information across each of those four categories, we intend to be as objective and as granular as possible. And so it really is things like, how wide the door is, how many steps, how high the steps are, like how does the door open, what sort of mechanism, is it automatic or manual? And the reality is that, there's quite a lot of detail there. And what we are hopeful is that essentially the product can do a lot of the heavy lifting from the kind of analysis and computational side of things. So a user can come in, they have this menu of different things they can sort of select. And the idea is they build a profile. And that then can sort of be, for the most part, embedded in their user experience, and the platform can do the recommendations based on those things. Now, the final part to this is we acknowledge, and I think it's really important actually, that accessibility is not just a personal thing that varies between someone's impairments, but it also varies between contexts. So if I go to a space by myself, it has to be step-free. If I'm with one or two friends, maybe a step is fine. If I go for half an hour, I might not need a toilet. If I go for a whole evening, I definitely will. And so all of a sudden, where in the past people have said, we're not accessible. If you've inquired, they've said, because we don't have this. And you say, well, I don't even need that. We're really trying to re-empower choice so that disabled people can actually choose a space that works for not just on their own particular needs, as opposed to some stereotype of disability, but also in that particular moment, as opposed to some kind of, arbitrary assessment of you need this thing and it doesn't exist. Because in many respects, we have to be pragmatic. We have to be understanding that the world, unfortunately, was not built with accessibility in mind. I'd rather that disabled people go out and about and experience the world and drive that change than sort of have to be forced to wait inside until some perfect universal design appears, which, you won't.
That's a good point. And I really appreciate that there's a variety in what people can choose and they can kind of figure out within context what works for them. I assume it has to be fairly challenging, right, to go and gather this data, because there is a lot of detail and information that you had suggested, like, the width of the doors, steps, things like that. There's a lot of detail. So how do you typically go about collecting that information and then verifying that it's accurate before you put it on the app?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the short answer is yes, it's challenging. And I think to that extent, we can very readily see why lots of platforms before us and actually and after us choose not to go into the level of detail. And that's where you end up with this sort of traffic light assessment of, accessible or partially accessible or inaccessible, or a sort of rating, 3 out of 5 accessibility stars. The problem with those platforms or with those kind of measurements or metrics, I think, is that whilst they are easy to kind of understand at a high level, they don't actually answer the questions that users have. And so therefore they're not helpful. So for us, I think if we want to do this properly, we have to then invest the time and the money and the effort into collecting the right level of data. So Sociability basically is a tool that collects sort of different sources of data. We actively send people to spaces. So we have a team of trained people. We call them our mappers. They go to restaurants, cafes, bars. They literally pound the pavement every day, and they are talking to those business owners and managers. They're explaining what we do and the importance of accessibility, which is also this part about raising awareness. And then they add that information into the app. And, that gives us the confidence that it's accurate, that it's as kind of verified and clean as possible. And then we can very comfortably say to our users, come to London, use our platform. The data we have is robust. The second is that we allow users to add information. This, I think, is definitely something we're continuing to think about in terms of how to make it as user-friendly and as easy and as fast as possible, as balanced against the fact that we want to have this high-quality data. And so it's definitely something that is continuing to evolve, but we have users adding their favorite places, taking photos, adding these tags, and making sure that they're able to share places that we as a sociability team can't get to with the rest of the community. And the third part, which is not live yet, but eventually will come online, is essentially a way for businesses to add information about their own spaces into the platform. We have to be careful though there, to be candid, that obviously we want to make sure that the user experience is prioritized and that the information is trustworthy. And there's a world in which, a business says, yeah, sure, accessible, tick the box, blah, blah. So we really just need to make sure that we have the right quality controls in place so that we trust the information is as accurate and as objective as possible.
I like that you have those different options built in there, that you have the people who are going to the physical sites to verify, and then the users have the ability to add tags as well. So I'm sure, obviously, there's a lot of different venues popping up, new ones, things like that, different updates. So it's nice that users can kind of add their tags and their photos to, allow for more options to show up.
One of the things we definitely see is that it's great to have all the information in the world. And hopefully that solves, a lot of this. But actually, I think what we've seen from users is that what can often be the most compelling thing is actually knowing another user with a similar disability went and had a good experience. And it's this sort of implicit trust that that person actually understands what accessibility means to me or to a similar person. And so therefore, the fact that they've actually gone and that added that information is like the endorsement they need. And so we actually find that for our user base in our community, it's not so much that we want to rely on everyone to add information, but it's actually about sharing the fact that they, were able to do what they wanted to is a really compelling way to get other people confident enough to go out and try.
I noticed you also have these mapping days, right? What typically happens during those days?
We call them mapping days, but essentially they're sort of facilitated, accessible community activities. And so the idea is that, literally based on kind of what I said then, we started to see that users were really taking the lead from other users going and having good experiences. And we thought, well, we can help sort of drive this by facilitating and arranging a fair bit of this. And so we basically get people together, we sort of suggest a location, and then they're a hybrid of a sort of information session about sociability and how to use the app. We'll actually show people how to use the app. We'll explain some of the questions they might have, and we'll sort of go around and actually add data into the platform, as well as basically a social activity. So we'll typically find a cafe and everyone has a tea or a coffee and some cake. And it's really just a chance to connect with other disabled people and to make sure that, I guess, that anxiety and that stress, particularly if somebody's coming into the public for the first time, is sort of as taken away as possible. And what we see, which is super exciting, is that when people come on a mapping day, they not only just meet people and get along, generally pretty well because there's a lot of common ground, but it actually, in many cases, is the kind of beginning of that snowball of confidence, where they've gone out once, it was a success. So they're keen to try another time, potentially with someone from the mapping day. If that goes well, they'll try a third time. And then all of a sudden, they just start to get in the habit of being able to go out and explore, and the confidence starts to build. And then it extends from not just going out to places, but to doing different types of activities, to really pursuing opportunities in a broader sense. And that is really what we're about at Sociability.
That's really great that it's kind of a twofold process where they're learning about the app and how to document, but they're also making those connections. I can really see how those work hand in hand to support people. What have been some of your, I don't want to say your biggest success story, but like something like a memorable experience from a user who has benefited from using Sociability? What are some, experiences that you think really showcase how effective the app has been in improving somebody's life?
Fortunately, there's lots of examples, which is nice. But I think two that sort of immediately come to mind, one, this sort of exact process. Like, we have definitely had users who the first time they traveled independently, for example, or got a train by themselves, that sort of thing, was for a mapping day or for a social activity. And we sort of helped them through that process and gave them the guidance and just make sure that if they were coming to the activity, we could, take as much of that anxiety and stress away as possible. And what's super nice to see is that a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, a month later, they might get in touch and be like, hey, just to let you know, since then, I've done X, Y, and Z, and now I'm doing this all the time. And what seemed like super frightening and impossible the first time, with your help, has kind of now super easy, but two, it's unlocked a whole bunch of other stuff. So we definitely had that with a user who caught a train for the first time to kind of our activities and now travels around all the time independently, which is super. And in a similar sense, we also have definitely seen that some of the friendship groups that have been kind of founded through Mapping Day, where people have come together and then got along really well, have just flourished. And now there are groups of people who spend a huge amount of time together traveling and going to gigs and just being friends, basically as a result of having first met at one of our events or activities. And I think that's exciting. It sort of shows, I think, hopefully the sustainable change we can drive if we give people the opportunities and the tools to be able to engage in the world around them, and just to start to share the kind of impact of what we do. Because I think at the end of the day, in some sense, it can seem very technical for a data company that provides information about spaces, but really it comes down to people. And I think it's super important to sort of remind everyone that that's the core of the mission.
Yeah, you could really see from your examples the community piece and the ability to help people feel confident, feel empowered, and make those connections to help get them into other places to make them feel more comfortable in other spaces. So yeah, I definitely see the overwhelming amount of data, which is awesome, but really the community piece and the connections shine through that, which really seem to make the app pretty special.
Yeah, and I think it just comes down to this point that at the end of the day, we don't think accessibility is like this compliance thing or this sort of tick the box. It's not there to have a database for the sake of it. It's to let it be used by people to go and do things. So 100%, that for us is definitely the most important outcome.
And do you have any specific future plans or development plans for sociability? Is there anything in the immediate future, in the near future that you're kind of hoping to do?
The great thing about having a really active and passionate community is you get lots of feedback, which is super helpful. And for us, I think it's definitely a fundamental part of hopefully what makes us really successful, because at the end of the day, we're building a tool for the community and we're really making sure that we're trying to prioritize what the community wants and also making sure that we're listening to, what's missing. It was made apparent when, I was a wheelchair user talking about disability and accessibility. And people very candidly, would call me out and be like, well, it can't just be for wheelchair users if you're talking about disability more broadly. And that was a great learning curve, just like, okay, awesome. It's useful to have lived experience to guide, how a solution can be brought to a problem, but it also can't blinker you. You really need to listen to the sort of full spectrum of people who are using it. We have lots of stuff that's on the product roadmap. Some of the highlights, I think, which we'll hopefully be able to have, live in the kind of next coming set of months, and particularly for the end of the year. One, we're definitely excited to release basically a brand new version of the app. The kind of underlying technology that the platform is built on, we're basically upgrading that to a new tech stack, and it's super exciting. It's much more powerful and stable and secure and professional, and I think that will really level up user experience for everybody. And it will also come with the release of a new desktop version, so being able to use Sociability properly on a browser at home on a computer, as opposed to trying to do everything on a small screen. The second thing is really thinking about how do we make sure that the way in which people interact with Sociability is as user-friendly as possible, but also as accessible as possible. There's obviously been the rise of conversational interfaces and chatbots and things like that. So we're really exploring how we can import some of that into the platform. So rather than everybody having to, click a lot of buttons and type in a lot of things, how do we make this as intuitive and user-friendly and really as kind of basically part of day-to-day experience and conversation as possible? So I think there's some exciting stuff on that front. And then we have, a whole host of other features that we're confident that'll just enhance the existing user experience, which we're excited to roll out sort of incrementally.
It really does seem like Sociability has made a lot of effort to listen to different needs and try to address those user needs and things like that. And that's very clear in your updates that, you're really thinking about the full user experience, which I'm sure will encourage more people to continue to use it and help us, continue to build that community.
And I think, part of that has been just an understanding that not everybody has also the same access to technology that we do. And so that was definitely a piece of key feedback that it works on the smartphone, particularly an Apple and an Android smartphone. But if you don't have one of those, what do you do? And I think it's really good to have a reminder that actually not everybody has a smartphone and they go out in the street and want to use. They might be on a computer or a Windows platform or something like that. So it's definitely just about listening to how do we make our tool, which is about accessibility, be as accessible as possible.
Do you have a specific message that you want to convey to individuals who may be seeking accessible places and venues?
Yeah, I think particularly if you're in the UK and particularly if you're in London, we'd suggest you use Sociability. We hope that it solves the problem for you. But I think for me, in terms of the kind of message to people, particularly looking for accessible places, I think is kind of what I said before about sometimes I think the challenge is that we let perfect be there to be the good. And that's actually not just for disabled people. A lot of the time, that's the business. They'll say, we don't have X, Y, or Z, so we can't have disabled people here. And they sort of just freak out. And there's this kind of lack of awareness, potentially some kind of misunderstandings and stereotypes and tropes around disability. And so people become really afraid of getting it wrong, basically, and they don't want to touch it. And it's one of these things that's easy to say, just don't come here. We very often see this where people say we have a step at the front and we can't do anything because it's an old building. And, we say, you can buy a wrap on Amazon for £15 and that would solve the problem. And they're like, really? I thought I'd have to demolish the whole front of the building. And so part of it is this kind of really lowering the stakes and actually just thinking, at the end of the day, it's about people helping other people. And so I think to that extent, for people looking for accessibility information, but also people thinking about making more accessible environments, it's, really be open to thinking outside the box and to actually ask them the questions and to having the conversation. And almost definitely there's a solution. And then actually what people find is that it's a lot easier and a lot more comfortable and more enjoyable than they thought. And I think it's just about getting that habit, flexing that muscle. That actually the first time you do something to make your space more accessible, it's a success. Then you do the next thing and the snowball starts. I think part of the reason that we haven't had a solution to date is because people have been really afraid of actually getting started. And so really what we're trying to encourage people is to actually just get the ball rolling. And it won't be perfect at the start, and there's going to need to be kind of flexibility improvement on both sides. But that's the only way we'll get to a stage where we can live in a world where there is like much more meaningful accessibility, and also people are comfortable thinking about this as a problem that can be solved.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I've had conversations on our show here too, where we've talked about people think accessibility has to require large-scale construction projects, and they're missing often the fact that there are other key things you could be doing to like get people more comfortable now. So I appreciate that sociability is not only helping people who are looking for these spaces, but also potentially helping businesses look and see, oh, I have this and it's considered accessible in this venue. I could let people know that I have this available. Or, oh, look what this business did to make this more accessible. I could do that easily in my space too. So I like that sociability is really about the promotion of the awareness. I think that's really key and important.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And I think definitely like on our end, the goal is to really make accessibility accessible. I think the challenge has been that for a long time, it's been in the domain or the realm of this like, professional audit certification types thing. And people think, well, an expert has to do this. I can't engage with the topic. And if the expert's not here, then, it's not my issue. And that's wrong. And at the end of the day, that is what has kept this kind of very conservative mindset around accessibility. And also, that's why I think for the most part has kept the kind of focus on wheelchair users, because like it's much easier to create compliance and regulatory, frameworks around physical mobility rather than like the level of brightness or noise or things like that. And so part of this is also not always defaulting to yourself, is there a ramp or a lift? And I'm a wheelchair user, so I like those things. But I think that's the point, that like unfortunately everyone's understanding of accessibility sort of collapses into this very kind of narrow focus. And then if you don't have a ramp or a step, people think, oh, we can't have any disability at all, rather than actually thinking much more broadly about the diversity that is very inherent in humanity, which in many respects is exactly what disability is. And sometimes we call it disability, sometimes we don't call it disability. But I think the goal is to really get people comfortable with this idea that everybody should feel welcome, and we can definitely create that. That's not impossible.
I think that just really solidifies everything we talked about today. I want to thank you so much, Matt, for being here with us today. For talking to us all about sociability and the work that is being done with the app and the platform. And I will make sure to link everything that we talked about in the show notes today for anybody listening, and in the transcript for anybody who's reading the transcript. It's at the bottom as well. But thank you so much, Matt, for sharing with us today.
Oh, thank you, Katie, for having me, and pleasure. Yeah, and look forward to hopefully spreading the word, but really appreciate your time, and thanks for having the conversation.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Assembling Inclusion podcast. I hope the information in this episode taught you something new, gave you a new idea, or showcased a new perspective. If you liked the episode, feel free to leave us a review or comment. If you have a recommendation for an individual or an organization who would make a great guest, you can message us or send us an email at assemblinginclusion@gmail.com. See you next time.